Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's presentation, The Continental Congresses. And this presentation is part of the series on the eve of the American Revolution, which talks about individual events leading up to the creation of the Declaration of Independence. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb. In a few moments here, he is going to share his screen. Okay. Jim, are you ready to get started?
I am indeed.
Great.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm glad you could join us. Okay, couple of notes before we begin. In June, we'll have the last talk, which is Declaration of Independence. I'm working on that now. And I expect to take off July and August and come back in September. At this point, I am very much considering doing another series of 4 to 6 talks about the Articles of Confederation and more particularly the U.S. Constitution. So if you have an interest in those things, or if you think there might be something else, by all means, contact me. Given that this is the 250th anniversary, it seems to me these are good things to talk about right now rather than, pottery making in Western Maryland. So I think that said, we'll get going. This is actually a note to me, not to you. So just sort of a quick review about what I spoke about last month. The Stamp Act, which was really what got things roiling with the American colonists and rising tensions with Parliament. There was a embargo, well, not embargo, but folks decided to not import British goods, not consume British goods. The merchants back in Great Britain didn't like that. They were losing a lot of business. And in the end, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in the spring of 1766. However, they passed the Declaratory Act of 1766, which is, it's actually the same law that they passed regarding Ireland in 50 years earlier, which basically said, you guys can pass all the laws you want, do whatever you want. Parliament ultimately has the final say. The acts of Parliament trump everything else. That worried people in the colonies. And it was also necessary before they passed, following immediately upon that, they passed what are called the Townshend Acts, named for Charles Townshend. And one of them was the Suspending Act, which basically shut down New York's government, not just the city of New York, but the entire colony, until they paid to quarter British troops in New York. The Commissioners of Customs Act, which moved enforcement of customs regulations from London to Boston and then to some other cities. Some people back then, some of the colonists might have called it the Commissioners of Extortion Act, because as one might predict, it created a lot of opportunity for corruption. The Indemnity Act, which reduced the tax on tea imported by the British East India Company because they were trying to compete with all the smuggled tea that was coming in, mostly from the Dutch. And then the Revenue Act, we talked about that last month, where all these taxes were applied to things like window glass, bottle glass, lead, a variety of items. So there was, and I didn't mention this last month, and I should have. There was actually a fifth act that was passed, but it was the following year, and I didn't include it because Charles Townshend had died before introducing this to Parliament, but it was introduced to Parliament the following year, and that's the Vice Admiralty Act. And this is an important law because historically, any violations of custom laws could involve moving the accused either back to London or to at least Halifax, Nova Scotia. This act established Vice Admiralty courts in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, and any violation of customs acts, you would be tried in one of those three cities. And maybe that sounds good. Well, it's better than going to Halifax or having to travel all the way to London. But of course, in any case, the individuals accused were not tried in local jurisdictions. They had to go to one of these three places and at their own charge, and if they failed to show up for court, they were considered guilty. The Vice Admiralty courts had judges. Those judges made the decision as to guilt or innocence. There is no jury. So this is depriving people accused of violating customs laws. It deprived them of trial by jury. And this is where our Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution comes in. And it's also in the Declaration of Independence. There's reference to this practice. It was harsh, and it violated the British Constitution. Like the Stamp Act, the colonies responded in their usual way, which was to resolve not to consume or import British goods and not to export goods to Great Britain. So it started in Boston, where British troops moved in, and the folks of Boston said, we should boycott all British goods, and all of you other colonies should do the same. And they did. And as a result, the Townshend Acts were repealed in May of 1770, except for the one act, the Indemnity Act, which allowed the British East India Company to bring in tea without paying that additional tax. It's still paying the 3 pence per pound of tea that everybody else was supposed to pay. That was part of the Revenue Act. The colonists kept drinking tea, but increasingly, instead of buying tea from the British East India Company, they bought tea that was smuggled in. I don't know where this number comes from. It's the only one I could find, but the estimate is 86% of all smuggled tea was smuggled in by the Dutch. And so their presence is visible in the colonies and really around the world. The Dutch East India Company, they even had their own coins like these from 1735. It has VOC, which are the initials for the name of the company, which is United East India Company is the English translation. So we got these folks, they're protesting by not buying British goods. And so what is the response? Well, the response is directed not at the king, but at his ministers. And initially by some of the major patriots of the Revolutionary War at this time are still hoping for reconciliation with the crown. So this is from a letter from Benjamin Franklin, who at the time was an agent for Massachusetts Bay Colony, essentially a lobbyist. And he says, I hope nothing that has happened or may happen will diminish in the least our loyalty to our sovereign or affection for this nation in general. I can scarcely conceive a king of better dispositions or more exemplary virtues, or more truly desirous of promoting the welfare of all his subjects. The body of this people, too, is of a noble and generous nature, loving and honoring the spirit of liberty, and hating arbitrary power of all sorts. We have many, very many friends among them. And, this wasn't meant for public consumption. This is a private letter that he had written. And it gives you a sense, Benjamin Franklin, is proud to be a British citizen. In 1773, the Indemnity Act was largely supplanted by a new law called the Tea Act. And what it did, its intention was to reduce the massive amount of tea that accumulated in warehouses in London. The British East India Company kept bringing over tea from East India, and by law, they were required to bring it to Great Britain, as all goods were supposed to be brought there. They'd be put in a warehouse, auctioned off eventually, and then exported again. So the British government was charging a tax on the import into the country, and then there'd be another tax on shipping it out. This law allowed the British East India Company and only the British East India Company to ship directly to the American colonies. So they didn't have to pay that import duty in London and thereby bring the price down to where they were competitive with the smuggled tea. And one of the things the law tried to do is convince colonists to buy company tea. Now, that company tea, when it was brought into North America, they were still paying 3 pence on a pound tax. But if it was cheap enough, they hoped that the colonists who preferred India tea as opposed to what the Dutch were bringing in, which I think was from further east, I think it was more China tea, has a lighter, more delicate taste. But they figured the colonists would buy the British East India Company tea, and in doing so, although they're still getting it cheaper, they'd still be paying that 3 pence per pound tax. So it would be an implicit acceptance of that tax and a Parliament's right to tax. Part of the reason for getting those warehouses cleared out is that British East India Company was in deep financial trouble. And many of the financial backers of the British East India Company were really wealthy folks in Great Britain, including a lot of members of Parliament and probably the Crown too. Meanwhile, back in the colonies, there were groups of people who were passing what they call resolves, that is, resolutions not to import British products, and particularly tea. Back in Great Britain, those resolutions were mocked. And this is an example. This actually was published the following year in 1775, but it has to do with the town of Edenton in North Carolina. And there, a group of 51 women signed their own Edenton resolves, resolving not to buy especially British tea. The cartoonist back in the old world was mocking that. I mean, you can see I've got a blow up on the right-hand side. You've got towards the center this young man kind of getting rather intimate with this young lady. Off to the right is this rather gruesome looking woman with a bizarre hairdo. And there's the kid unattended, food falling on the floor, dog licking kid and food. Over in the background, you got these folks, seemingly doing something disreputable. In the far background, you have this woman drinking out of this huge, probably Chinese porcelain punch bowl, and punch bowl meant mostly rum. So it attacked the morality of these women.
Is the dog peeing on the woman at the bottom too?
Yeah, he is doing that. Yes. I wasn't going to point that out.
Something. I don't. Is it like symbolic? What is the symbology?
Well, I haven't looked at it carefully enough, but these boxes with these pegs in it, if you look over to the far left-hand side, they've opened one and it looks like coins pouring out into this guy's hat. So these seem to be some sort of collection boxes. An image like this, you could spend hours looking at it, really zooming in on it and looking for all the visual puns and the satire. They're very rich. It's a long tradition in the Anglo world. And anyway, one of the interesting things about this is that, when we talk about the revolution, we talk about Declaration, Constitution, all that stuff, we tend to forget about the women. And women were really important in these events because traditionally in American colonial society, they did most of the purchasing. They're the ones who are making those decisions. And in this case, in Edenton, North Carolina, what they're engaged in is a political act that, carries some weight. Elsewhere in New York, we get this poster from April 21st, 1774, and I'm going to read this to you. The ship, the Nancy, a British ship, a merchant ship, had arrived in New York Harbor, and Benjamin Lockyer was the captain of that ship. And it reads, "The sense of the city relative to the landing of the India Company's tea being signified to Captain Lockyer by the committee, nevertheless, It is the desire of a number of the citizens that at his departure from hence, he should see with his own eyes their detestation of the measures pursued by the ministry and the India Company to enslave this country. This will be declared by the convention of the people, by that is a polite way of saying the mob, at his departure from this city, which will be on next Saturday morning about 9 o'clock, when no doubt every friend to this country will attend. A little bit of bullying going on there. If you don't show up, it means you support the parliamentary acts. The bells will give the notice about an hour before he embarks from Murray's Wharf. By order of the committee, and I don't know if that's a committee of observation or a committee of correspondence. And another one from Boston, Massachusetts. I like this one. Brethren and fellow citizens, you may depend that those odious miscreants and detestable tools to ministry and governor, the tea consignees, that is, the retailers who had an arrangement with the East India Company to sell their tea, those traitors to their country, butchers who have done and are doing everything to murder and destroy all that shall stand in the way of their private interest, are determined to come and reside again in the town of Boston. I therefore give you this early notice, that you may hold yourselves in readiness on the shortest notice to give them such a reception as such vile ingrates deserve. And that's by somebody named Joyce, Jr., and in parentheses, chairman of the committee for tarring and feathering. I don't know if that's an official committee exactly, but, and then there's a little note at the bottom saying, anybody who tears these posters down will be on my wrong side. Again, I've said this before, there's a lot of bullying going on during the American Revolution, a lot of vigilantism. Wasn't smooth sailing. And speaking of sailing, we have this image. This is of the Boston Tea Party. And let me remind everybody that the Boston Tea Party was not a unique event. It was maybe the earliest, but it wasn't unique. There were tea parties in a number of port towns up and down the eastern seaboard, some of which just sort of, chased off, vessels like the Nancy, which had almost 700 cases of tea on it. But at the time the Nancy left, she also took the captain of another vessel. That captain had tried to smuggle a number of chests of tea into New York Harbor, and that got thrown into the water. And of course, we had a tea party in Annapolis, Maryland. So this is an image. It's later. It's from 1789, but it shows talks about approximately 70 men. There was a big mob at Boston Harbor, but about 60 of these guys dressed in Native American garb got on the ship, dumped all the tea. It's 342 chests of it, valued at 18,000 pounds, into Boston Harbor. That's midnight, December 16, 1773. Now, they were dressed up as Indians, but as far as I know, none of them were masked. The point in dressing up as Indians was not to hide their identity. I mean, there are hundreds of people there on the dock. I mean, most of these guys would have been recognized by some people there. The idea of dressing up in Native American garb was a statement that we're Americans, we're not British. That subtlety would not have been lost on people at the time. It's somewhat lost through American history. I think most people have heard that they dressed up as Indians or specifically Mohawks, but no real explanation why. And so the implication may be they were just trying to hide their identity. And that is not the case. They were expressing a different identity. Meanwhile, back in Great Britain, so Benjamin Franklin is in London. Again, he's agent for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's a lobbyist. And he was also the postmaster, had been a postmaster of the North American colonies since 1753, so 20 years. And he presented a petition to Parliament to have them remove Governor Thomas Hutchinson and a Lieutenant Governor, Andrew Oliver, from office. Why? These two guys wrote a series of combined 13 letters to Parliament back in 1772, suggesting that the officers like them should be paid directly by the crown and not by the colony, because that way the colony would have no leverage over them. And they were also suggesting that Parliament deploy troops to Massachusetts Bay Colony. So, I mean, they're kind of traitors. It's treasonous, right? Those letters in 1773 came into Benjamin Franklin's hands. And he's postmaster general. You know, the mails are supposed to be private. And what he did after reading them was he sent them to Samuel Adams back in Massachusetts and asked him to, you know, share the contents with a few people, but by no means don't publish these things. I'll get in a raft of trouble. Adams shared it with leadership in the General Assembly of Massachusetts. Eventually, by the middle of 1773, summer of 1773, they were published in local newspapers. This got back to Parliament, and they were really peeved at him. But anyway, Benjamin Franklin there is petitioning them to remove the governor and a lieutenant governor. The Solicitor General, a guy named Wedderburn, in an hour-long diatribe in front of the Privy Council, just humiliated Franklin. I think this is in Frank Burns's documentary on Franklin. And a lot of historians consider this a pivotal moment in Franklin's evolution, if you will, as a patriot. He stood there motionless and stoic throughout that hour, and at the end he left. But clearly this had an incredible effect on him. This is a guy who is very loyal to the crown, and here he is being dressed down, humiliated in public. The crown actually did replace the governor with General Thomas Gage, who was commander-in-chief of armed forces in North America. So essentially they replaced the civilian governor with a military governor, essentially martial law. It's important to keep in mind, though, that much of Parliament was against the colonies. We have members of Parliament who stood up, made speeches that denigrated American colonists, and particularly New Englanders. Call them sly, troublesome, duplicitous, puritanical rabble, scoundrels, locusts. And they also said that they were cowards, that during King George's War back in the 1740s, that when attacking the French fort, Louisburg, that the New England militia turned and ran. They were cowards. And it was the British troops who took the place.
Hey,
That was
Jim,
yeah.
we have a question in the chat that
Mhm.
says, is it known who might have disclosed Hutchinson's letters to Parliament, Benjamin Church, for example?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, somebody gave a packet of those letters to Benjamin Franklin. Now, at the time, the mails were a sieve. Even one of Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter to one person saying, "Well, I hope the people I'm writing to get a chance to read this before the British ministry does." It looks like there was no respect for privacy in the mails. And it's one of the reasons why Franklin was considered really sloppy in France later on when he was negotiating with the French, because he'd leave all kinds of important papers lying around on his desk where anybody could see him. And Franklin knew that there were no secrets. Unless you sent something by special courier, you had no chances are somebody was going to be reading your mail. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there is somebody who knows that. I don't. But then I'm an archaeologist, not an historian. At any rate, there was these awful speeches just talking about how cowardly the New Englanders were, and they were nothing of the kind. They distinguished themselves at Louisburg. They distinguished themselves during the French and Indian War. And so it was just outright lies. But of course, no way of fact checking back then. But Parliament and the ministry and the king were really stung by the fact that these laws that they had passed had to be repealed in the face of boycotts. So they were really ticked off with the colonists. But as an example of some support, they did have some prominent supporters. There were just not enough of them. Edmund Burke being one, William Pitt another, and this is a quotation from him, speech before the House of Lords. Resistance to your acts was necessary as it was just, and your vain declarations of the omnipotence of Parliament, is referring to the Declaratory Act of 1766, and your imperious doctrines of the necessity of submission will be found equally impotent to convince or to enslave your fellow subjects in America who feel tyranny, whether ambitioned by an individual part of the legislature or the bodies who compose it, is equally intolerable to British subjects. This glorious spirit of Whiggism animates 3 millions in America who prefer poverty with liberty to gilded chains and sordid affluence, and who will die in defense of their rights as men, as free men. That's pretty startling coming from a rather influential, respected member of Parliament, House of Lords, and one-time Prime Minister. So these are the acts, again, talked about them last month, the Boston Port Act, which basically shut down the port of Boston until the city made restitution for the tea that they destroyed. Colonists in Boston throughout Massachusetts said, well, all of us didn't do that. Why are you punishing all of us rather than the perpetrators? Of course, finding the perpetrators would have been quite impossible. The Massachusetts Government Act, which basically, again, set up General Thomas Gage as the military governor of Massachusetts. So he was appointed by the Crown. Town meetings were severely circumscribed. You weren't supposed to have a town meeting anywhere in Massachusetts without getting approval. The problem with that approach is that, like a lot of situations like that, even today, they only held the city of Boston. They had no power across the rest of Massachusetts. The military governor, his power and his authority extended beyond Boston, but his power to do anything was limited to the city. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the governor to move a trial of any royal official to another colony or to Great Britain. And of course, in doing that, there are no colonists around to testify against those officials because they're not all going to hop in a boat and zip over to London to testify against somebody. And that, by the way, is in our 6th Amendment to the Constitution. That's where that comes from. I don't know what happened there. Okay. And there's our 6th Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So, for example, you couldn't arrest somebody in, let's say, New York or New Hampshire and send them down to Louisiana, because that's not where they were accused of any particular crime. And this amendment also applies to the accused. That's all, just the accused, no further qualifiers. The Quartering Act, which authorized housing of up to 4,000 British soldiers in unoccupied buildings. So you didn't have to worry about them being put up in your house. But, if you had a barn, you had some unoccupied house, anything like that, these soldiers could be forced upon you. And that's where our 3rd and 5th Amendments come for the Constitution. The 3rd Amendment prohibits quartering of troops during peacetime. Absolutely prohibits. During wartime, it's possible to quarter troops, but the Fifth Amendment requires that you be paid for the services you're rendering, that is, housing these troops. The most insulting of the acts was the Quebec Act. That expanded the Canadian territory, which, remember, after the French and Indian War, everything north of the St. Lawrence, all that was alternatively called Canada, Quebec, that became totally British. And what this law did was it extended that territory south and west down along the Ohio Valley, effectively blocking, I think I might have an image of that. No, I don't. Effectively blocking the colonies from moving westward. Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, many, Pennsylvania, three of their boundaries were well defined, north, east, and south. But the western boundary, many of them thought extended to the Pacific Ocean. But with this law, yeah.
We have another question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Which of the coercive acts do you feel to be the most odious to Massachusetts? One historian, Mary Beth Norton, thinks that it is the administration of justice, quote, Murder Act. Others think it is the Massachusetts Government Act.
I think the Quebec Act was the one that really ticked people off. And it has nothing to do with, I mean, it's certainly, to a certain extent, has something to do with the potential for Western expansion, but mostly it established Quebec as essentially an authoritarian state. It's not democratic. It's a French state, and it's a Catholic state. And New Englanders, and that most of colonial America was Protestant. They hated Catholics, and they considered this a real slap in the face. So I would say emotionally, the Quebec Act probably had the most impact. The Boston Port Act had the most significant impact because Boston, they built ships, they shipped goods, they fished. Closing down that port, moving it up to Salem, what do those people do for a living? And they couldn't even import food. When they closed it down, They wouldn't even allow canoes across the marsh, okay? So all food, all goods had to be transported by land into Boston. And I don't know if people were actually starving. You get that kind of sense from some of the documents, but I think that's hyperbole. But it was a rough time for them. So the Boston Port Act really had a significant economic and that impact, and that is what spurred the rest of the colonies on to what they had done. The First Continental Congress, September 5th through October 26, 1774. Unlike the Albany conference in 1754, where only 7 colonies showed up, in this First Continental Congress, 12 out of 13 colonies were represented. Georgia didn't show up. They formed 2 committees. One was to look into the colonial rights and Parliament's infringements of those rights. The other committee was supposed to look at the effects of those parliamentary actions on trade, on the economy. There were no other committees because everybody was on one or both of these committees. If you look at first blush, you go, well, how can this be? How can you have a committee meeting simultaneously on the effects of these infringements before you actually demonstrate what the rights are and how Parliament's infringing upon them? And what I see in this is that they already knew what their rights were, or had an idea what their colonial rights are. And they already knew how Parliament was infringing on those rights. What these committees did was they were simply putting down on paper what those things they knew to be true. They laid them out, they developed a logical argument, and there's certainly debate and everything, but these aren't research committees. These are committees who are putting this stuff down on paper. Now, about 10 days into the Congress, Paul Revere shows up riding his horse. He reminds me of that new version of Poldark you see on PBS, where the main character Poldark, every 5 minutes you see him on the screen racing his horse across the top of the bluff one way or another. Paul Revere, in some ways, seemed like a very prestigious letter carrier. But he shows up in Philadelphia with the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves is Suffolk County, which included most of what is now Boston, doesn't include Cambridge, but it was a large area. And the Suffolk Resolves call for the formation of community militias. This is not a colony-wide militia. They're talking about each community, and New England is set up on a town basis, township basis. So there are a lot of towns there, and each of them were expected to raise their own militia. And they resolved to embargo all British trade. The Continental Congress took this stuff and used it. And in many ways, we're just reviving the old practices from 1765 and 1770, which is non-importation. Non-consumption, non-importation of British goods, effective immediately. Non-importation of slaves, and non-exportation to Britain, Ireland, or the British West Indies, effective in 1 year. So we weren't going to buy any British stuff, but we were okay with them buying our stuff, at least for a year. Bit of Yankee pragmatism there, I guess. The First Continent, we had some advertisements going out for this talk and other venues, and I think I used the picture of Independence Hall, which is a lovely building, but it was the State House at the time as our legislative structure. That's not where the First Continental Congress was held. It was actually held in Carpenter's Hall, which was a private building and had no connection with the political structure of Pennsylvania at the time. And the reason for doing that was the Pennsylvania delegation, I think they thought was a bit leaned too much towards the Crown side. So anyway, they published these articles of association, and this is what they look like. Can you all read that? And those are all the signatures on the right-hand side, but it was engrossed, and you can't read that either, it's too small. But I got the first paragraph there I want to read to you because it tells you about where these folks were in terms of the British government. The association entered into by the American Continental Congress in behalf of all the colonies. We, His Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the delegates of the several colonies, deputed to represent them in a Continental Congress held in the city of Philadelphia on the 5th day of September, 1774, avowing our allegiance to His Majesty, our affection and regard for our fellow subjects in Great Britain and elsewhere. Yeah, here again, they're not screaming radicals here. They're not saying down with the king, off with his head. They're announcing their loyalty to the crown. But further on in the document, it says, in our most serious deliberation, the state of the whole continent find that the present unhappy situation of our affairs is occasioned by a ruinous system of colonial administration adopted by the British ministry about the year 1763, evidently calculated for enslaving these colonies, and with them the British Empire, in prosecution of which system various acts of Parliament have been passed, and there they are. And they have 14 points, which I'll get to in a moment. But here they're saying, Your Majesty, your ministers have been screwing this up for the past 10 years. And they're trying to enslave us and by extension, the entire British Empire, because laws of Great Britain applied to the entire empire, not just to the North American colonies. So they saw this infringement of their liberty as also affecting their fellow subjects back in the Great Britain. So there are 14 points. I'll go through them fairly quickly. A couple we already hit. No importation of British goods. No importation of slaves after December 1st. No use or purchase of East India tea upon which tax paid after December 1st. And none at all after March 1st, 1775. So, in 6 months, even if a tax, the 3 pence per pound had not been paid, we're still not buying East India tea. Non-exportation to Great Britain, Ireland, and the British West Indies after September 10th of the following year. Merchants and factors were supposed to immediately inform their employers back in Great Britain and Ireland, don't ship any goods because we can't unload them here in North America. Ship owners were supposed to command their captains not to import anything because they wouldn't let it off the vessel. 7 seems kind of funny at face value. Improvement of sheep herds and non-export to West Indies. And number 8 kind of clarifies that. Encourage frugality and industry, particularly manufacture of wool, while discouraging gaming, cockfighting, theater, and excessive mourning apparel. So a lot of sheep were exported to the West Indies as a food item. But what they're saying here is let's improve the breeds, produce more wool, and weave our own cloth in violation of the Navigation Acts. Also, discouraging, wasteful spending. Number 9, no price gouging, and any shop owner found guilty of having done so, and guilt was not a trial or anything, and just if people accused you of it, then you were in trouble. And so nobody would patronize that store. Seize any goods imported and stored at owner's expense or sold. So if a vessel unloads British goods, they can be impounded, put into a storehouse, and of course that isn't free. So be impounded at the owner's expense, or those goods could be sold and the profits used to support the people of Boston to buy them food. Formation of committees of observation to enforce provisions of agreement. Again, these are essentially vigilante groups. Formations of committees of correspondence to share information about transgressors. So they had a network of people communicating, is a ship just left here with British goods. We chased them off. He's heading south, so keep an eye out for him. Number 13 is about price gouging, and I need to research this a little better. I'm not sure what the difference between it and number 9 are. And then finally, we have the embargo of any colony that violates the agreement. So we're all in this, all the colonies. And actually, all the colonies signed on, even Georgia. Okay, battles of Lexington and Concord, the 250th anniversary of which was just this past month. This is a period painting, right after the fact, essentially by Amos Doolittle, showing the British in red and dead colonists on the ground. The numbers I got from the National Park Service. The British heard there was a supply of ammunition, particularly gunpowder, at Concord. So they sent a detachment of 700 redcoats from Boston area to Concord to try to secure that gunpowder and destroy it or bring it back. The militia found out. You all heard about Paul Revere and his ride and, lanterns and the North Church of Boston, all that. So they knew the British were coming. Not that it would have been hard to hide. 700 guys in red coats is going to make a lot of noise and it's going to be pretty visible. A group of Minutemen, that is the militia who was supposed to respond on a minute's notice, not necessarily all the militia, they formed on Lexington Green. They were not in the road to Concord. So the British had clear passage. An officer detached a number of redcoats, infantrymen, to confront the militia, told them to disperse, which apparently they were inclined to do. But a shot was fired, nobody knows by whom, and the British opened fire and the militia returned fire. I think 3 militiamen were killed, a number were wounded, and then the British rejoined the main march on to Concord. Got to Concord, spent a few hours looking around for gunpowder. As far as I know, didn't find any. But they met a lot more colonial militia. And they headed back to Boston, a distance of 16 miles. And that actually is the Battle of Lexington and Concord, is the British fighting a rearguard action all the way back to Charlestown. The militia, they met with reinforcements on the way back, 1,000 British regulars, but there's an estimated 4,000 colonial militia who had formed by the time they made it back to Charlestown. So it was sort of a running gunfight. And the numbers we got from the Park Service are 73 British regulars dead, 49 militia dead, 174 British regulars wounded, 41 militia. Missing, I don't quite get, 26 British regulars, 5 colonial militia. Maybe a couple of militiamen were in debt or something, decided to use the opportunity to duck out. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know how they could be missing. Just maybe not accounted for. British regulars, I could see some of those guys kind of abandoning ship. It's like, I'm here in a new world, had my way paid here by the crown. I'm gonna take a powder. But yeah, the battles of Lexington and Concord were really stretched over those 16 miles. There was a confrontation at Lexington and eventually one at Concord, but it really was a running battle on the way back. I threw this image in by Paul Revere, as it happens. And this is of the Boston massacre of some 5 years earlier. And the reason I put this in here is because here you have an image of British troops opening fire on a mob. And the captain and I think 4 of the soldiers were charged with murder of John Adams, eventually our second president, famously defended them successfully. I put that in here because this is sort of like a Kent State moment, where you've got an arm of the state opening fire on its own citizens, but it's sort of a mob context. That's not true at Lexington and Concord. That was not a mob. Those were organized militias. And these 2 forces firing at one another. This is no longer a matter of soldiers shooting at a mob, deplorable as that is. This is civil war. The Revolutionary War effectively began in April of 1775. We tend to think of the birth of our nation in 1776. That's the Declaration of Independence. Civil War actually broke out in 1775. So we get the Second Continental Congress. So that, shots fired at Lexington, that was the so-called shot heard round the world. And since we come from another generation, I'll remind you guys, school children used to have to memorize this thing. There are 4 stanzas to it, I think. This is the first one by Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1837. Not one of my favorite authors, tends to be a bit obscure. But it's a simple poem. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. A lot of my generation, shot heard around the world had to do with a baseball game, I think in New York. But here, the rude bridge, it's not that rude actually, it's a pretty nice bridge, going across the Concord River, which was tidal. I know I was in a rowboat rowing my parents there many years ago and had to fight the incoming tide. Let me tell you, that was a tough row. As far as a flag, I don't think the colonists had any flags, so it's a bit imaginary. And embattled farmers, he's drawn a contrast between citizen soldiers and British regulars. Congress convened about 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord at Independence Hall this time, not Carpenter's Hall. Georgia again did not show up. I got nothing against Georgia. It's just, and Maryland's guilty of this a lot too. With Maryland, it's fence sitting rather than absenteeism. They apparently sent one representative from one parish in Georgia who was involved in the debates, but because he didn't represent the whole colony, couldn't vote. But at this point, Congress effectively becomes the government of the United Colonies and remained the governing body till at least 1778. I guess you could probably argue 1781. On June 14th, 2 months later, they created the Continental Army. Again, this is no longer mob violence. This is open civil war. The Battle of Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston, June 17th. You'll notice the preposition I use, battle for Bunker Hill. The battle was for Bunker Hill, but as most of us know, it was fought at Breed's Hill next door. I say battle for Bunker Hill because that was the military objective of both sides. So they were battling for that hill, but they were battling on a neighboring hill. They issued a declaration of causes on July 6th, and this is somewhat incendiary document, but it laid out why the colonists felt justified in armed resistance. 2 days later, they also ratified or adopted the so-called olive branch petition to King George, which again says, we're loyal to you, it's your ministers, we think we could still resolve this. Those documents made it to London I think August 21st of 1775. But on August 23rd, King George III proclaimed parts of the British colonies in America open and avowed rebellion. So he's saying, okay, we now have a civil war here. He may have seen these documents, including the olive branch petition, but he didn't receive them officially while he was on the throne, as the phrase goes. And so he basically ignored these documents. And the thing about, once, Lexington and Concord, once those shots were fired, all those laws passed by Parliament and all that non-importation, non-consumption stuff that the Continental Congress, the previous Continental Congress had adopted, all that was moot. We have open civil war. So the takeaways for this, first of all, there were leaders, colonial leaders, Sam Adams probably being principal among them, who were real firebrands and wanted American independence. Most, however, maintained their loyalty to the crown, blaming the king's ministers in Parliament. Historians still debate the extent of King George III's power, but my reading of it is that unlike his predecessors, going back to the Stuarts and all of his successors, King George was more than a constitutional monarch. He wasn't just a figurehead. He actually had the power to select his ministers, his prime minister and his cabinet ministers, and had the power to get a number of members of Parliament elected. It was a very corrupt system. So although the colonists were blaming the ministers and asserting their loyalty to the king, that might have been misplaced. And it's something they eventually learned. But the Crown and Parliament, I mean, you read through the proceedings of Parliament and the letters written by these people, the speeches, they're just so arrogant. And they so misread the colonial situation. The first talk I gave in this series of talks, I talked about how sophisticated and cosmopolitan the colonies were. And back in Great Britain, they didn't seem to get that. I think they thought that, they were basically a bunch of hicks here. And so they totally misread the American situation. But April 19, 1775, effectively turned this long debate since the end of the French and Indian War. It was always tense, but it was a fairly cordial debate and full of, polite remonstrances and petitions, and just put an end to all that. And the results, Great Britain had this second war in a generation, just as long and as expensive as the first. They just got through the French and Indian War, 10 years of tension with the colonies, and then a new war, which generated a huge war debt. And there was no compensation because, they lost. With the French and Indian War, they gained Quebec, they gained Canada, or what they didn't already have. And it's like, big deal. They got access to some more beaver pelts, not a major return on their investment. But with the loss of the American colonies, they lost a huge amount that it took them years to make that up by, exploiting colonies elsewhere in the world, like India. They lost the Chesapeake colonies with all that tobacco, a huge source of wealth for England and Scotland. They lost the mid-Atlantic colonies, which provided grains and a lot of the food that went to the West Indies, where they produced sugar, another major source of wealth that made a lot of people back in Great Britain exceedingly wealthy. A lot of them built these huge houses. But those sugar colonies relied on the mid-Atlantic colonies for food. And then, of course, they lost the New England colonies with all its shipbuilding. New England's built great ships, and they were great fishermen. And so Great Britain lost all of that in losing the war with the colonies. I'm always reminded, and we'll see this in a couple months. It'll be on Turner Classic Movies, but 1776, the musical. It's a lot of fun. It's a great humor. Some pretty catchy songs. But I always remembered this speech from Benjamin Franklin, as played by Howard Da Silva, who in the photograph is in the middle. You have what's his name? You got William Daniels playing John Adams, and Ken Howard over here playing Jefferson. But this is Benjamin Franklin in the musical talking to John Dickinson, who was from Pennsylvania, and he represented, well, I'll talk about this next month, but he sort of represented the more conservative end of the Continental Congress. Never was such a valuable possession so stupidly and recklessly managed than this entire continent by the British Crown. Our industry discouraged, our resources pillaged, worst of all, our very character stifled. We've spawned a new race here, Mr. Dickinson, rougher, simpler, more violent, more enterprising, less refined. We're a new nationality. We require a new nation. Peter Stone, the late Peter Stone, was a very good playwright, and he chose his words carefully. Read those last two sentences, short periodic sentences. We're a new nationality. We require, we don't deserve, there's no entitlement here. We require a new nation. I think that's up. I think that play, for a lot of its silliness and everything, the dance routines, is actually a pretty good depiction of the tension in the Second Continental Congress between those under John Dickinson's leadership, who were more, really wanted to stay in the empire, and the smaller but more radical group led by John Adams, who really said, we need a new country, man. This is not working out. It's going to happen sooner or later. War is inevitable. I mean, he said that numerous times. I don't mean just in the play. I mean in various documents. So this, do see the musical when it comes up again. Like I said, July 4th, they always play it. But this is really a good summary of where the Second Continental Congress had arrived at in 1776. But it built on over a year of violent encounters. And I'll talk about that a little bit next month. I mean, one of the things that's going on is, while we're essentially laying siege to Boston, we have armies going up to Canada and battling in Montreal, well, not so much Montreal, but Quebec. There's a lot more warfare going on in 1775 than most of us tend to think of. Most of us, think, okay, Declaration of Independence, after that, we're going to war. And that's not true. Anyway, that's all I have for this evening. I will happily take questions.
So it is 8:01. I did want to read a comment real quick from the chat. It says comment only. On the right of Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, there is a puff of smoke below the Butcher's Hall sign. Several civilians were put on trial for alleged firing on the Crown and acquitted. 2 of the 8 soldiers were guilty of manslaughter and branded on their thumbs.
That may be true, but there was nobody was hung for murder. And John Adams took a lot of heat for defending them, but effectively they got off. And it's an interesting event. I mean, I don't know about the, who fired first or whatever, but one of the reasons that Parliament thought it was necessary to export accused officials and soldiers back to Great Britain to stand trial was the argument that they could not, they wouldn't have a fair trial in the colonies. This event in 1770 demonstrates the falseness of that assessment. They did have a fair trial and in fact were exonerated. Probably much to the chagrin of many Bostonians, but nonetheless. Okay.
All right.
I'm
Well,
fine.
thank you everybody for being here tonight.